Chapter 9 October 17th, Wednesday. Standing at the intersection of Ometasando and Aoyamadori, Yoshino once more took out his notebook. 6-1 Minami Aoyama Sugiyama Lodgings. That had been Sadako's address 25 years before. The address had him worried. He followed Ometasando as it curved, and sure enough, 6-1 was the block opposite the Nezu Museum, one of the more upmarket districts in the city. Just as he'd feared, there were nothing but imposing red brick condos where the cheap Sugiyama lodgings should have been. Who were you kidding anyway? How were you supposed to follow this woman's tracks 25 years later? His only remaining lead was the other kins who joined the theater group at the same time as Sadako. Of the 7 who'd come in that year, he'd only been able to find contact information for 4. If none of them knew anything about Sadako's whereabouts, then the trail would have gone dead. And Yoshino had a feeling that was exactly what would happen. He looked at his watch. 11 in the morning. He dashed into a nearby stationery shop to send a fax to the Izu Oshima bureau. He might as well tell Asakawa everything he had found out up to this point. At that very moment, Asakawa and Ryuji were at that bureau, Heiatsu's home. "Hey, Asakawa, calm down!" Ryuji yelled toward Asakawa, who was pacing around the room with his back turned. Panicking won't help, you know. The typhoon warnings flowed steadily from the radio. Maximum wind velocity, barometric pressure near the eye of the storm, millibars, northeasterly winds, areas of violent winds and rains, heaving swells. It all rubbed Asakawa the wrong way. At the moment, Typhoon number 21 was centered on a point in the sea roughly 150 kilometers south from Cape Omiyazaki, advancing in a northeasterly direction at a speed of roughly 20 kilometers an hour, maintaining wind speeds of 40 meters per second. At this rate, it would hit the sea just south of Oshima by evening. It would probably be tomorrow, Thursday, before air and sea travel was restored. At least, that was Heiatsu's forecast. "Thursday," he says. Asakawa was seething. "My deadline is tomorrow night at 10. You damn typhoon. Hurry up and blow through, or turn into a tropical depression, or something. When the hell are we going to be able to catch a plane or a boat off this island?" Asakawa wanted to get angry at someone, but he didn't even know who. "I never should have come here. I'll regret it forever. And that's not all. I don't even know where to begin regretting. I never should have watched that video. I never should have got curious about Tomoko Oishi and Shuichi Iwata's deaths. I never should have taken a cab that day. Shit. Don't you know how to relax? Complaining to Mr. Heiatsu isn't going to get you anywhere." Ryuji grabbed Asakawa's arm with an unexpected gentleness. "Think about it this way. Maybe the charm is something that can only be carried out here on the island. It's at least possible. Why didn't those brats use the charm? Maybe they didn't have the money to come to Oshima. It's plausible. Maybe these storm clouds will have a silver lining. At least try to believe it, and maybe you'll be able to calm down. That's if we can figure out where the charm is." Asakawa brushed away Ryuji's hand. Asakawa saw Heiatsu and his wife Fumiko exchange a glance, and it seemed to him they were laughing. 2 grown men going on about charms. "What's so funny?" He started to advance on them, but Ryuji grabbed his arm, with more force than before, and pulled him back. "Knock it off. You're wasting your energy." Seeing Asakawa's irritation, The kind-hearted Heiatsu had begun to feel almost responsible for transportation being disrupted on account of the typhoon. Or perhaps he was just sympathetic at the sight of people suffering so because of the storm. He prayed for the success of Asakawa's project. A fax was due to arrive from Tokyo, but waiting seemed only to ratchet up Asakawa's annoyance. Heiatsu tried to defuse the situation. "How is your investigation coming?" Heiatsu asked gently, seeking to calm Asakawa. "Well, one of Shizuko Yamamoto's childhood friends lives right nearby. If you'd like, I can call him over and you can hear what he has to say. Old Gen won't be out fishing on a day like this. I'm sure he's bored. He'd be happy to come over." Heiatsu figured that if he gave Asakawa something else to investigate, it would be bound to distract him. "He's nearing 70, so I don't know how well he'll be able to answer your questions, but it has to be better than just waiting." "All right." Without even waiting for the answer, Heiatsu turned around and called to his wife in the kitchen. "Hey, call Gen's place and have him get over here right away." Just as Heiatsu had said, Genji was happy to talk to them. He seemed to like nothing better than talking about Shizuko Yamamoto. He was 68, 3 years older than Shizuko would have been. She'd been his childhood playmate, and also his first love. Whether it was because the memories became clearer as he talked about them, or just because he was stimulated by having an audience, the recollections came pouring out of him. For Genji, talking about Shizuko was talking about his own youth. Asakawa and Ryunji learned a certain amount from his rambling, occasionally tearful stories about Shizuko. But they were aware that they could only trust old Gen so far. Memories were always liable to being prettified, and all this had happened over 40 years ago. He might even be getting her confused with another woman. Well, maybe not. A man's first love was special, not someone he'd mix up with someone else. Genji wasn't exactly eloquent. He used a lot of roundabout expressions, and Asakawa soon got tired of listening. But then he said something that had Asakawa and Ryuji listening intently. "I think that what made Chizu change was that stone statue of the ascetic we pulled up out of the sea. There was a full moon that night." According to the old man, Shizuko's mysterious powers were somehow connected to the sea and the full moon. And on the night it happened, Genji himself had been beside her, rowing the boat. It was 1946, on a night toward the end of summer. Shizuko was 21, and Genji was 24. It was hot for so late in the season, and even nightfall brought no relief. Genji spoke of these events of 44 years ago, as though they had happened last night. That sweltering evening, Genji was sitting on his front porch lazily fanning himself, gazing at the night sky calmly reflected on the moonlit sea. The silence was broken when Shizu came running up the hill to his house. She stood in front of him, tugging at his sleeve, and cried, "Gen, get your boat. We're going fishing." He asked her why, but all she would say was, "We'll never have another moonlit night like this." Genji just sat there as if in a daze, looking at the most beautiful girl on the island. "Wipe that stupid look off your face and hurry up." She pulled at his collar until he got to his feet. Genji was used to having her push him around and tell him what to do, but he asked her anyway, "What in the world are we going fishing for?" Staring at the ocean, she gave a brisk reply. "For the statue of the ascetic." "Of the ascetic?" With raised eyebrows and a note of regret in her voice, Shizuko explained that earlier in the day, some occupation soldiers had hurled the stone statue of the ascetic into the sea. In the middle of the island's eastern shore, there was a beach called the Ascetic's Beach, with a small cave called the Ascetic's Grotto. It contained a stone statue of En-no Ozunu, the famed Buddhist ascetic who had been banished here in the year 699. Ozunu had been born with great wisdom, and long years of discipline had given him command of occult and mystic arts. It was said that he could summon gods and demons at will. But Ozunu's power to foretell the future had made him powerful enemies in the world of books and weapons, and he'd been judged a criminal, a menace to society, and exiled here to Izu Oshima. That had been almost 1,300 years ago. Ozunu holed himself up in a small cave on the beach and devoted himself to even more strenuous disciplines. He also taught farming and fishing to the people of the island, earning respect for his virtue. Finally, he was pardoned and allowed to return to the mainland, where he founded the Shugendo monastic tradition. He was thought to have spent 3 years on the island, but stories of his time there abounded, including the legend that he had once shot himself with iron claws and flown off to Mount Fuji. The islanders still retained a great deal of affection for En-no Ozunu, and the ascetic's grotto was considered the holiest place on the island. A festival, known as the Festival of the Ascetic, was held every year on June 15th. Right after the end of World War II, however, as part of their policy toward Shintoism and Buddhism, the occupation forces had taken En-no Ozunu's statue from where it was enshrined in the cave and tossed it into the ocean. Shizuko, who had deep faith in Ozunu, had evidently been watching. She had hid herself in the shadow of the rocks at Worm's Nose Point and watched carefully as the statue was cast from the American patrol boat. She memorized the exact spot. Genji couldn't believe his ears when he heard they were going fishing for the statue of the ascetic. He was a good fisherman with strong arms, but he'd never tried to catch a stone statue. But there was no way he could just turn Shizuko down, given the secret feelings he nursed for her. He launched his boat into the night, thinking to take this opportunity to put her in his debt. And truth be told, being out on the sea under a beautiful moon like this, just the two of them, promised to be a wonderful thing. They'd built fires on Ascetic's Beach and at Worm's Nose as landmarks, and now they rowed farther and farther out to sea. Both of them were quite familiar with the ocean here, the lie of the seafloor, the depth, and the schools of fish that swam here. But now it was nighttime, and no matter how bright the moon was, it illuminated nothing beneath the surface. Genji didn't know how Shizuko intended to find the statue. He asked her, while working the oars, but she didn't answer. She just checked their position again by the bonfires on the beach. One might have been able to get a pretty good idea of where they were by gazing over the waves at the fires on the beach and estimating the distance between them. After they'd rowed several hundred meters, Shizuko cried, "Stop here!" She went to the stern of the boat, leaned down close to the surface of the water, and peered into the dark sea. "Look the other way," she commanded Genji. Genji guessed what Shizuko was about to do, and his heart leapt. Shizuko stood up and took off her splash-patterned kimono. His imagination aroused by the sound of the robe slipping across her skin, Genji found it hard to breathe. Behind him, he heard the sound of her jumping into the sea. As the spray hit his shoulders, he turned around and looked. Shizuko was treading water, her long black hair tied back with a rag and one end of a slender rope clenched between her teeth. She thrust her upper body out of the water, took 2 deep breaths, then dived to the bottom of the sea. How many times did her head pop up from the surface of the water to gasp for air? The last time, she no longer had the end of the rope in her mouth. "I've tied it fast to the ascetic. Go ahead and pull him up," she said in a trembling voice. Gen shifted his body to the bow of the boat and pulled on the rope. In no time, Shizuko climbed aboard, draped her kimono around her body, and came up beside Genji in order to help him haul up the statue. They placed it in the center of the boat and headed back to the shore. The whole way back, neither Genji nor Shizuko said a word. There was something in the atmosphere that quashed all questions. He found it mysterious that she'd been able to locate the statue in the darkness at the bottom of the sea. It was only 3 days later that he was able to ask her. She said that the ascetic's eyes had called to her on the ocean floor. The green eyes of the statue, master of gods and demons, had glowed at the bottom of the deep, dark sea. That's what Shizuko had said. After that, Shizuko began to feel physical discomfort. She'd never even had a headache up until then, but now she often experienced searing pains in her head, accompanied by visions of things she'd never seen before flashing across her mind's eye. And it happened that these scenes she had glimpsed very soon manifested themselves in reality. Genji had questioned her in some detail. It seemed that when these future scenes inserted themselves into her brain, they were always accompanied by the same citrus fragrance in her nostrils. Genji's older sister had married and moved to Otawara on the mainland. When she died, the scene had presented itself to Shizuko beforehand. But it didn't sound like she could actually, consciously predict things that would happen in the future. It was just that these scenes would flash across her mind, with no warning, and with no inkling of why she'd witnessed those exact scenes. So Shizuko never allowed people to ask her to predict their futures. The following year, she went up to Tokyo, despite Genji's efforts to stop her. She came to know Heihachiro Ikuma and conceived his child. Then, at the end of the year, she went back to her hometown and gave birth to a baby girl, Sadako. They didn't know when Genji's tale would end. 10 years later, Shizuko jumped into the mouth of Mount Mihara, and to judge by the way Genji related the event, it seemed he had decided to blame it on her lover, Ikuma. It was perhaps a natural thought, as he had been Genji's rival in love, but his obvious resentment made his account hard to sit through. All they'd gleaned from him was the knowledge that Sadako's mother had been able to see the future, and the possibility that this power had been given her by a stone statue of En-no Ozunu. Just then, the fax machine began to hum. It printed out an enlargement of the headshot of Sadako Yamamura that Yoshino had got from theater group Soaring. Asakawa was strangely moved. This was the first actual look he'd had at this woman. Even though it had only been for the briefest moment, he'd shared the same sensations as her, seen the world from the same vantage point. It was like catching the first glimpse of a lover's face in the dim morning light, finally seeing what she looks like, after a night of entwined limbs and shared orgasms in the dark. It was odd, but he couldn't think of her as hideous. That was only natural, although the photo that came through the fax machine was somewhat blurred around the edges. Still, it fully communicated the allure of Sadako's beautifully regular features. "She's a fine woman, isn't she?" Ryuji said. Asakawa suddenly recalled Mai Takano. If you compared them purely on the basis of looks, Sadako was far more beautiful than Mai. And yet the scent of a woman was much more powerful with Mai. And what about that eerie quality that was supposed to characterize Sadako? It didn't come through in the photograph. Sadako had powers that ordinary people didn't have. They must have influenced the people around her. The second page of the fax summarized information about Shizuko Yamamura. It picked up right where Genji's story had left off just now. In 1947, Having left behind her hometown of Sashikiji for the capital, Shizuko suddenly collapsed with head pains and was taken to a hospital. Through one of the doctors, she came to know Heihachiro Ikuma, an assistant professor in the psychiatry department of Taido University. Ikuma was involved in trying to find a scientific explanation for hypnotism and related phenomena, and he became very interested in Shizuko when he discovered that she had startling powers of clairvoyance. The finding went so far as to change the thrust of his research. Thereafter, Ikuma would immerse himself in the study of paranormal powers, with Shizuko as the subject of his research. But the two soon progressed beyond a mere researcher-subject relationship. In spite of his having a family, Ikuma began to have romantic feelings towards Shizuko. By the end of the year, she was pregnant with his child, and to escape the eyes of the world, she went back home, where she had Sadako. Shizuko immediately returned to Tokyo, leaving Sadako in Sashikiji, but 3 years later she returned to reclaim her child. From then until the time of her suicide, evidently, she never let Sadako leave her side. When the 1950s dawned, the partnership of Heihachiro Ikuma and Shizuko Yamamura was a sensation in the pages of the newspapers and the weekly news magazines. They provided a sudden insight into the scientific underpinnings of supernatural powers. At first, perhaps dazzled by Ikuma's position as a professor at such a prestigious university, the public unanimously believed in Shizuko's powers. Even the media wrote her up in a more or less favorable light. Still, there were persistent claims that she could only be a fake, and when an authoritative scholarly research association weighed in with the one-word comment, "questionable," people began to shift their support away from the pair. The paranormal powers Shizuko exhibited were mainly ESP-related, such as clairvoyance or second sight, and the ability to produce psychic photographs. She didn't display the power of telekinesis, the ability to move things without touching them. According to one magazine, simply by holding a piece of film in a tightly sealed envelope against her forehead, she could physically imprint upon it a specified design. She could also identify the image on a similarly concealed piece of film 100 times out of 100. However, another magazine maintained that she was nothing more than a con woman, claiming that any magician, with some training, could easily do the same things. In this way, the tide of public opinion began to rise against Shizuko and Ikuma. Then Shizuko was visited by misfortune. In 1954, she gave birth to her second baby, but it became ill and died at only 4 months of age. It had been a boy. Sadako, who was 7 at the time, seemed to have showered a special affection on her newborn little brother. The following year, in 1955, Ikuma challenged the media to a public demonstration of Shizuko's powers. At first, Shizuko didn't want to do it. She said that it was hard to concentrate her awareness the way she wanted to among a mass of spectators. She was afraid she'd fail. But Ikuma was unyielding. He couldn't stand being labeled a charlatan by the media, and he couldn't think of a better way to outwit them than by offering clear proof of her authenticity. On the appointed day, Shizuko reluctantly mounted the dais in the lab theater, under the watchful eyes of nearly 100 scholars and representatives of the press. She was mentally exhausted to boot, so these were hardly the best conditions for her to work under. The experiment was to proceed along quite simple lines. All she had to do was identify the numbers on a pair of dice inside a lead container. If she had just been able to exert her powers normally, it would have been no problem. But she knew that each one of the 100 people surrounding her was waiting and hoping for her to fail. She trembled. She crouched down on the floor. She cried out in anguish, "Enough of this!" Shizuko herself explained it this way. Everybody had a certain degree of psychic power. She just had more of it than others did. But surrounded by 100 people all willing her to fail, her power was disrupted. She couldn't get it to work. Ikuma went even further. It's not just 100 people. No, now the whole population of Japan is trying to stamp out the fruits of my research. When public opinion, fanned by the media, begins to turn, then the media says nothing the people don't want to hear. They should be ashamed. Thus, the great public display of clairvoyance ended with Ikuma's denunciation of the mass media. Of course, the media interpreted Ikuma's diatribe as an attempt to shift the blame for the failed demonstration, and that's how it was written up in the next day's newspapers. A fake after all. Their true colors revealed. Taido University professor, a fraud. 5 years of debate ended. Victory for modern science. Not a single article defended them. Toward the end of the year, Ikuma divorced his wife and resigned from the university. Shizuko began to become increasingly paranoid. After that, Ikuma decided to acquire paranormal abilities himself, and he retreated deep into the mountains and stood under waterfalls, but all he got was pulmonary tuberculosis. He had to be committed to a sanatorium in Hakone. Meanwhile, Shizuko's psychological state was becoming more and more precarious. 8-year-old Sadako convinced her mother to go back home to Sashikiji to escape the eyes of the media and the ridicule of the public. But then Shizuko slipped her daughter's gaze and jumped into the volcano. And so 3 people's lives crumbled. Asakawa and Ryuji finished reading the 2-page printout at the same time. "It's a grudge," muttered Ryuji. "Imagine how Sadako must have felt when her mom threw herself into Mount Mahara. She hated the media? Not just the media. She resented the public at large for destroying her family, first treating them like darlings, and then when the wind changed, scorning them. Sadako was with her mother and father between the ages of 3 and 10, right? She had first-hand knowledge of the vagaries of public opinion." "But that's no reason to arrange an indiscriminate attack like this." Asakawa's objection was made in full consciousness of the fact that he himself belonged to the media. In his heart, he was making excuses. He was pleading, "Hey, I'm just as critical of the media's tendencies as you are." "What are you mumbling about?" "Huh?" Asakawa realized that unknowingly he had been voicing his complaints, as if they were a Buddhist chant. "Well, we've begun to illuminate the images on that video. Mount Mahara appears because it's where her mother killed herself, and also because Sadako herself had predicted its eruption. It must have made a particularly strong psychic impression on her. The next scene shows the character for Mountain, Yama, floating into view. That's probably the first psychic photograph Sadako succeeded in making when she was very small." "Very small?" Asakawa didn't see why it had to be from when she was very small. "Yes, probably from when she was 4 or 5. Next, there's the scene with the dice. Sadako was present during her mother's public demonstration. This scene means that she was watching, worried, as her mother tried to guess the numbers on the dice." "Hold on a minute, though. Sadako clearly saw the numbers on the dice in that lead bowl." Both Asakawa and Ryuji had watched that scene with their own eyes, so to speak. There was no mistaking. And Shizuko couldn't see them. Is it so strange that the daughter could do what the mother couldn't? Look, Sadako was only 7 then, but her power already far outstripped her mother's. So much so that the combined unconscious will of 100 people was nothing to her. Think about it. This is a girl who could project images onto a cathode ray tube. Televisions produce images by an entirely different mechanism from photography. It's not just a matter of exposing film to light. A picture on TV is composed of 525 lines, right? Sadako could manipulate those. This is a power of a completely different order here. Asakawa still wasn't convinced. If she had so much power, what about the psychic photo she sent to Professor Miura? She should have been able to produce something much more impressive. You're even dumber than you look. Her mother had gained nothing but unhappiness by letting people know about her power. Her mother probably didn't want her to make the same mistake. She probably told Sadako to hide her abilities and just lead a normal life. Sadako probably carefully restrained herself so as to produce only an average psychic photo. Sadako had stayed in the rehearsal hall alone after everyone else had left, so that she could test her powers on the television set, still a rarity in those days. She was trying to be careful not to let anyone know what she could do. "Who's this old woman who appears in the next scene?" asked Asakawa. "I don't know who that is. Perhaps she came to Sadako in a dream or something, whispered prophecies in her ear. She was using an old dialect. I'm sure you've noticed that everyone here now speaks fairly standard Japanese. That lady was pretty old. Maybe she lived in the 12th century, or maybe she has some connection to Enno Ozunu. Next year, you're going to have a child. I wonder if that prediction really came true." "Oh, that? Well, there's the scene with the baby boy right after that. So I originally thought it meant that Sadako had given birth to a boy, but according to this fax, that doesn't appear to be the case. There's her brother who died at 4 months old." "Right. I think that's it." "But what about the prediction? The old woman is definitely speaking to Sadako. She says you. Did Sadako have a baby?" "I don't know. If we believe the old lady, then I guess she did." "Whose child was it?" "How should I know? Listen, don't think I know everything. I'm just speculating here. If Sadako Yamamura did have a child, who was the father? And what was the child doing now?" Ryuji stood up suddenly, banging his knees on the table as a result. "I thought I was getting hungry. Look, it's way past noon. Say, Asakawa, I'm going to go get something to eat." So saying, Ryuji headed for the door, rubbing his kneecaps. Asakawa had no appetite, but something still bothered him, and he decided to tag along. He just remembered something Ryuji had told him to investigate, something he'd had no clue how to approach, and so hadn't done anything about. This was the question of the identity of the man in the video's last scene. It might be Sadako's father, Heihachiro Ikuma, but there was too much enmity in the way Sadako looked at him for that. When he'd seen the man's face on the screen, Asakawa had felt a dull, heavy pain somewhere deep inside his body, accompanied by a strong feeling of antipathy. He was a rather handsome man, particularly around the eyes. He wondered why she hated him so. No matter what, that kind of gaze was not one Sadako would have turned on a relative. There was nothing in Yoshino's report to suggest that she had squared off against her father. Rather, he got the impression that she was close to her parents. Asakawa suspected it would be impossible to discover the identity of this man. Nearly 30 years had undoubtedly changed his looks considerably. Still, just on the off chance, maybe he should ask Yoshino to dig up a photo of Ikuma. He wondered what Ryuji would think about this. Wanting to take the matter up with him, Asakawa followed Ryuji outside. The wind blew loudly. There was no point in using an umbrella. Asakawa and Ryuji hunched their shoulders and ran down the street to a bar in front of the harbor. "How about a beer?" Without waiting for a reply, Ryuji turned to the waitress and called out, 2 beers. Ryunji, to go back to our earlier conversation, what do you think the images on that video are? Finally. Don't know. Ryuji was too busy eating his Korean barbecue lunch special to even look up, so he gave a curt answer. Asakawa stabbed a sausage with his fork and took a swallow of his beer. Out the window they could see the pier. There was nobody at the ticket window for the Tokai Kisen ferry line. Everything was silent. No doubt all the tourists trapped on the island were sitting at the windows of their hotels or B&Bs, looking worriedly at the same dark sea and sky. Ryunji looked up. I imagine you've probably heard what people say goes through a person's mind at the moment of death, right? Asakawa returned his gaze to the scene in front of him. The scenes from your life that have made the deepest impression on you are replayed, sort of like a flashback. Asakawa had read in a book in which the author described an experience along those lines. The author had been driving his car along a mountain road when he lost control of the steering wheel, plunging the car into a deep ravine. During the split second that the car hung in the air after leaving the road, the author realized that he was going to die. And at the instant he realized that, a sequence of different scenes from throughout his life came pitter-pattering up and flashed through his brain, so clearly that he could see every detail. In the end, miraculously, the writer had survived, but the memory of that instant remained vivid for him. You can't be suggesting. Is that what this is? Asakawa asked. Ryunji raised a hand and signaled the waitress to bring him another beer. All I'm saying is, that's what the video reminds me of. Each one of those scenes represents a moment of extreme psychic or emotional engagement for Sadako. It's not too much of a stretch to think that they were the scenes in her life that left the deepest impressions, is it? I get it. But hey, does that mean that? Right. There's a strong possibility that that's the case. So Sadako Yamamura is no longer of this world? She died, and the scenes which flitted through her mind at the moment of death had taken this shape and remained in the world of the living. Was that it? So why did she die? And another thing, what was her relationship with the man in the last scene of the video? I told you to stop asking me so many questions. There's a lot I don't understand about it, either. Asakawa looked unconvinced. Hey, try using your head for a change. You rely too much on other people. What would you do if something happened to me and you were stuck trying to figure out the charm all by yourself? That hardly seemed likely. Asakawa might die, and Ryuji might solve the riddle alone, but the opposite would never happen. Asakawa was sure of that, if of nothing else. They went back to the quote-unquote bureau, where Hayatsu was waiting for them. You had a call from a fellow named Yoshino. He wasn't at his office, so he said he'd call back in 10 minutes. Asakawa sat in front of the phone and prayed for good news. The phone rang. It was Yoshino. I've been trying to call you. Where were you? There was a note of reproach in his voice. Sorry about that. We went out to get a bite to eat. Okay. Now, did you get my fax? Yoshino's tone changed. The note of criticism disappeared, and his voice became gentler. Asakawa felt something unpleasant coming. Yes, thanks. It was very helpful. Asakawa switched the receiver from his left hand to his right. And so? Did you find out what happened to Sadako after that? Asakawa asked enthusiastically. There was a pause before Yoshino replied, however. No, I hit a dead end. The second he heard this, Asakawa's face crumpled as if he were about to burst into sobs. Ryuji watched as if he found it amusing to see a man's expression turn from hope to despair before his eyes. Then he plopped himself down on the floor facing the garden and stretched his legs out in front of him. "What do you mean, dead end?" Asakawa's voice had risen several notes. "I was only able to locate 4 of the interns who joined the troop with Sadako. I called them, but none of them know anything. They're all middle-aged guys of around 50 now. All any of them could tell me was they hadn't seen her since shortly after the death of Shigemori, the company's representative. There's no more information to be had about Sadako Yamamura." "Nonsense. This can't be the end of it." "Well, how does it look on your end?" "How does it look on my end? I'll tell you how it looks. It looks like I'm going to die tomorrow night at 10 o'clock. And not just me, my wife and daughter are going to die on Sunday morning at 11. That's how it looks." Ryuji called out from behind him, "Hey, don't forget about me. You'll make me feel bad." Asakawa ignored him and continued, "There have got to be other things you can try. Maybe there's someone besides the interns who would know what happened to Sadako. Listen, my family's lives depend on it." "Well, not necessarily, though." "What are you talking about?" "Maybe you'll still be alive after the deadline passes." "You don't believe me. I get it." Asakawa could feel the whole world go dark before his eyes. "Well, I mean, how could I really believe 100% in a story like this?" "Now, look, Yoshino." How should he put it? What did he need to say to convince him? "I don't even believe the half of it myself. It's stupid. A charm. Come on." "But you see, if there's even a 1 in 6 chance that it's all true, it's like Russian roulette. You've got a gun with 1 bullet in it, and you know there's only 1 chance in 6 that when you pull the trigger, it'll kill you. But could you pull that trigger? Would you risk your family on those odds? No, you wouldn't. You'd move the muzzle away from your temple. If you could, you'd throw the whole damned gun into the ocean. Right? It's only natural." Asakawa was all wound up now. Behind him, Ryuji was wailing, "We're idiots! Both of us idiots!" "Shut up!" Asakawa shielded the receiver with the palm of his hand as he turned to yell at Ryuji. "Something wrong?" Yoshino lowered the tone of his voice. "No, it's nothing. Listen, Yoshino, I'm begging you. You're the only one I can count on." Suddenly, Ryuji grabbed Asakawa's arm. Giving way to anger, Asakawa spun around, but when he did, he saw that Ryuji was looking unexpectedly earnest. "We're idiots. You and I both have lost our cool," he said, quietly. "Could you hold on a minute?" Asakawa lowered the receiver. Then to Ryuji, "What's the matter?" "It's so simple. Why didn't we think of it before? There's no need to follow Sadako's trail chronologically. Why can't we work our way backwards? Why did it have to be cabin B4? Why did it have to be Villa Log Cabin? Why did it have to be South Hakone Pacific Land?" Asakawa's expression changed in a heartbeat as he came to a realization. Then, in a much calmer mood, he picked up the receiver again. "Yoshino?" Yoshino was still waiting on the other end of the line. "Yoshino, forget about the theater company lead for a while. There's something else I urgently need you to check on. It's just come up. I believe I've already told you about South Hakone Pacific Land." "Yeah, you did. It's a resort club, right?" "Right. As I recall, they built a golf course there about 10 years ago, and then gradually expanded into what they are now. Now, listen. What I need you to look up is, what was there before Pacific Land? He could hear the scratching of pen on paper. What do you mean, what was there before? Probably nothing but mountain meadows. You may be right. But then again, you may be wrong. Ryuji tugged at Asakawa's sleeve again. And a layout. If there was something standing on that land before the resort, tell your gentleman caller to get a map that shows the layout of the buildings and the grounds. Asakawa relayed the request to Yoshino and hung up the phone, willing him to come up with something, anything, by way of a lead. It was true. Everybody had a little psychic power.